Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football, officially game week. For Mike Norvell, the Florida State Seminoles going across the pond, playing what is a very dangerous Georgia Tech program in 2024. Now, we did our game previews, our game predictions on Sunday afternoon. Want to take a deeper dive into this matchup, specifically from a Florida State lens, and talk about a couple of things Florida State can do to really give this Georgia Tech program some problems Saturday afternoon in Ireland. You look at this Georgia Tech program and say, make no mistake about it, there are some elements of this football team that make them extremely dangerous. You go back to the 2023 season and say, Georgia Tech went on the road, beat Miami. They gave Georgia everything they could handle in that Week 12 game in 2023, kind of got hot towards the end of that 2023 season. In return, a lot of difference makers, specifically on the offensive side of the football, right? Quarterback Haynes King, one of the most dynamic gunslingers that you'll see in the ACC. This is a guy that averaged over 6 yards per carry, also led the ACC in passing touchdowns. You look at wide receiver Eric Singleton Jr. and say that was one of the best true freshman wide receivers that we saw in the country in the 2023 season. You have an 1,000-yard ball carrier in Jamal Haynes. There are aspects of this Georgia Tech team that, make them really dangerous in the 2024 season. That being said, we said this Sunday afternoon, there are also some significant question marks that we have about this Georgia Tech program. How can Florida State potentially exploit some of those question marks? That's what I want to get into today. Now, before we get into it, and as always, one to the Florida State fans, even Georgia Tech fans, and the Florida State fans, I know you all have done doing your prep on this Georgia Tech program. Would love to hear some of your thoughts, opinions on some of Florida State's keys to the game. And if we have any Georgia Tech fans listening to this, would love to hear some of your opinions in the comments section as well. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. This is definitely one of those games that immediately following this game, we'll be going live, breaking down what we saw. And without further ado, let's get into this one. I want to start with what is kind of a simple key to the game, but I think really the most important metric that we're looking for in this football game on Saturday, and that is this Florida State rushing attack. We've kind of said it all off season long. You look at Florida State on offense, where are those known commodities for this Florida State program? It's on the offensive line and the running back room. And I think Mike Norvell, not only against this Georgia Tech program, but really throughout the 2024 season, is going to lean on this rushing attack. You look on the inside of this offensive line as we pull up the offensive line depth chart and say, you look at Richie Leonard, 330 pounds. You look at Keandre Jones and TJ Ferguson, 330 plus. You look at Jeremiah Byers, 330 plus. This is an offensive line that is big. It's full of maulers. And then you look at Georgia Tech's defensive line and say they only got one defensive lineman that goes over 315. That's Zeke Biggers, who's a very good football player. But Georgia Tech struggled mightily against the run in the 2023 season, giving up over 223 rushing yards per game. And they lose some legitimate good front seven defenders and guys like Kyle Kennard. And so can Florida State establish this rushing attack early is probably the biggest key for this Florida State offense. And I think secondly, why it's so important is you look at making DJU comfortable. You got a lot of new faces, right? We are pretty confident that this passing attack is going to be just fine. But early on in the season, there might be some growing pains, right? You have a transfer new face quarterback in DJU. You have a ton of wide receivers who are talented, but they're new. They don't have a ton of experience. There is reason to believe that this Florida State passing attack might take a couple weeks to finally hit its stride. When you're talking week 0 early on in the season, you want to simplify some of these matchups. And if you can get this ground attack going against the Georgia Tech program that has really struggled to stop the run, that's by far this biggest key to the game. I think it's Florida State's strength on offense in 2024. And I think, quite frankly, it's Georgia Tech's weakness on defense in 2024. I think another reason why this is so important is you look at what's the best way to stop a Georgia Tech offense that we think is going to be pretty dang good. Just keep the ball out of their hands, right? Continue to control the time of possession, limit the amount of times Haynes King can touch the football. If you're Florida State, you probably don't want this game to turn into a gunslinging shootout because that probably favors Georgia Tech. I think Florida State could win a game that's a shootout, track meet type of game, but that's probably not how Florida State wants to play this. And so you look at Florida State controlling the line of scrimmage. I think their offensive line is at least significantly more physically imposing than Georgia Tech's front seven. I think you have a ton of running backs in the backfield that can do so many different things. And you have a quarterback in DJU who goes 6'4", 250, can get involved in that rushing attack too, especially if you want to implement some of those power schemes. And so I look at the biggest mismatch in this football game. I think it's this Florida State rushing attack versus a Georgia Tech rushing defense that really struggled in 2023. And I just don't know if they did enough in the transfer portal to make me that confident that Georgia Tech can stop Florida State running the football in the 2024 season. I think the second key to Florida State on offense, we got 2 for offense, we got 2 for defense. Going to the second key for Florida State on offense, it's attacking these linebackers in space. You look at the Georgia Tech linebacker room. I actually like the linebackers for Georgia Tech, but what they struggled with in 2023 was kind of going sideline to sideline, being able to play in space and having that range. I think a good comparison to Georgia Tech's linebackers probably would be a linebacker like DJ Lundy, who's a hammer between the tackles, stopping the run. But when you ask DJ Lundy to get out in space, I think DJ Lundy has gotten better in that department, but that's obviously not where he excels the most. I look at Florida State, what they can do attacking Georgia Tech's defense and say, hey, can we get the football to guys like Lawrence Tuafili and Jalen Lucas out of the backfield, get him matched up on linebackers and man coverage, because that's a matchup that significantly favors Florida State. And I think secondly, you talk about getting DJU, continue to get him comfortable in this Florida State offense. The best thing you can do is just give him some easy access throws, right? Some swing passes, some screens, maybe some end arounds. Get DJU settled in this football game with some easy throws to guys like Lawrence Tuafili and Jalen Lucas. There was a reason that Mike Norvell wanted to get Jalen Lucas in the transfer portal, because he's an X factor on offense. This is one of those games that I really think you could get Jalen Lucas some opportunities to really hit some explosive plays in this Florida State passing attack, where you're not necessarily asking DJU to push the ball downfield week 0 early in the season with a ton of new wide receivers. So those are the 2 keys that I look at for Florida State on offense. Now you flip over to defense. I think it all starts with, you got to keep Haynes King in the pocket. You go back to Georgia Tech's film in 2023. Haynes King he's elite when he gets outside of the pocket. This is a guy that is extremely dynamic running the football, over 700 rushing yards, averaged over 6.1 yards per carry, but also really good throwing on the run. It becomes very clear when you watch Georgia Tech and Haynes King in 2023. This is a quarterback that wants to get out of the pocket, play a little backyard football, create with his legs, and kind of like Jalen Milroe in the 2023 season, where when you forced Jalen Milroe to stay in that pocket, you could tell he was uncomfortable. That's probably a very similar conversation that you could have with Haynes King. If you can keep Haynes King in the pocket, that's where he's most uncomfortable operating this Georgia Tech offense. Now, there's 2 different things I think you could do to kind of mitigate Haynes King from getting outside the pocket and creating in space. One, being really intentional with your pass rush lanes. And we know guys like Patrick Payton and Marvin Jones Jr., they're going to be able to get after the quarterback. But in this specific game, you want to make sure that, hey, we're getting after the quarterback. We're impacting the pocket, but we're not letting Haynes King get outside the pocket. So you got to be really disciplined with your pass rush lanes in terms of keeping Haynes King in the pocket. I'm a little less concerned with the amount of sacks that Florida State gets in this football game, and a little bit more concerned with how many times Haynes King is able to get outside the pocket and create with his legs. I think the second thing you could do is you kind of use your linebackers as that quarterback spy, whether it's DJ Lundy or Cam Riley or Blake Nicholson. Can you ask your linebackers to spy Haynes King? And when he does get outside of the pocket, are these linebackers good enough to go track down and hunt down Haynes King? Those are kind of the 2 things that you're looking at in terms of keeping Haynes King inside the pocket, because, again, you look at when this Georgia Tech offense is most dangerous, it's when Haynes King is outside creating on his own. I think the last key for this Florida State program is create turnovers. We talked about it all offseason. This Florida State defense was, for lack of better terms, really, really dang good in the 2023 season. One of the things that was surprising when you go back into the numbers, Florida State wasn't great creating turnovers. Only forced 1.2 turnovers per game. That was 104th in the country. Talk about all that talent in the defensive back room. You talk about that elite pass rush Florida State had. They were able to create a lot of havoc, get their hands on a lot of footballs, but they didn't necessarily turn that into actual game-changing turnovers. Can Florida State do that against Georgia Tech? That's a massive storyline, because you look at Haynes King, for as dynamic and as exciting as Haynes King is, Haynes King does turn the football over. He is going to be a gunslinger. He's going to put the ball in harm's way. Can you capitalize on that at points in this football game to create those game-changing turnovers? Because I look at Georgia Tech and say, Georgia Tech, it's going to be hard to stifle Georgia Tech on offense. They got a lot of difference makers all over the football field. They returned their two leading receivers. They returned their two leading rushers in Jamal Haynes and Haynes King. There are difference makers, legitimate difference makers on the offensive side of the football for Georgia Tech. They are going to move the football somewhat on Florida State. But when they do start moving the football, can you find that 1, 2, or 3 turnovers to stifle those drives and kind of change the momentum of this football game? That's probably the last key that you're looking for against Georgia Tech on Saturday. Again, I look at Georgia Tech and say I'm a really big fan of Georgia Tech heading into 2024. I'm a massive fan of what Brent Key is doing within this program. But you look at Florida State and say, one, you think they match up pretty dang well with this Georgia Tech program. You look at Georgia Tech wants to run the football. They ran the football top 30 most in the country last year. Florida State was solid against the run, wasn't great. But I think what you're kind of thinking is, hey, we got elite defensive backs that we can go leave out on islands. Make no mistake about it, Fentrell Cypress and A.Z. Thomas, two of the best cornerbacks that we see, not in the ACC, but in the country. Can we potentially walk some safeties in the box, put a lot of bodies in the box, and really try to take this Georgia Tech rushing attack away, force Haynes King to beat us from the pocket? That's probably what you're looking for against Florida State. And again, if you can get some of those turnovers, that is certainly going to help as well. We'll close it down there. Would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. Going to be a really fun game. Line is moving towards Georgia Tech, right? It opened at 13.5. It's down to 11.5. Going to be a fun game in Ireland. The boys are fired up. We'll recap it immediately following the game. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.